The November rain fell like needles. 11:47 in the evening, and the streets of Miami were empty except for the sound of water hammering concrete and the distant hum of a broken neon sign that flickered red, then dark, then red again. Allara Chen stumbled around the corner of Chen's corner store, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body moving as if each step required negotiating with pain itself. She was 27 years old. She looked 40. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, hung in wet ropes down her face. One eye was swollen completely shut, the skin around it a grotesque purple that deepened to black at the edges. The other eye was open but unfocused, glassy with shock or exhaustion or both. Handprints circled her throat like a necklace of violence, dark and angry and impossible to hide. They would not fade for weeks. She knew this because they had come before. Her white nanny uniform was torn at the shoulder. The fabric hung loose, exposing skin beneath, soaked completely through with rain and something else that stained the white a faint rust color. She was shaking. Not from the cold, though November in Miami carried a bite that cut through the usual heat. From fear. In her right hand, clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white, she held $17. 17. That was all that remained. One $5 bill, 2 ones, and the rest in coins that weighed her pocket down like stones. She was supposed to produce $150,000 in 12 days. 12. The number echoed in her mind like a death sentence. In her left coat pocket, worn thin and fraying at the seams, she carried a prayer card. The edges were creased from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The image was faded, a saint she could not name anymore, words printed beneath in Spanish that her mother had taught her to read before everything fell apart. She touched it sometimes without meaning to, the way other people touched their phones or their wallets. A habit born of desperate habit. She rounded the corner and froze. 3 men stood outside the convenience store entrance. They were young, maybe 30, with the kind of faces that came from a specific bloodline of violence. Expensive suits despite the rain, tailored to move with them, not against them. Guns in their hands, held loosely, casually, as if they were extensions of their bodies and not tools of death. Their voices were low, controlled, the way dangerous men spoke when they wanted to sound reasonable. A homeless man cowered against the brick wall beside the store. He was older, maybe 60, his grey beard matted, his clothes layer upon layer of theft and charity. His hands were up, shaking visibly even from where Allara stood frozen 10 feet away. He was begging. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't take anything. I was just trying to get warm." One of the men stepped closer. He had a tattoo on his neck that looked like a serpent. "The boss does not appreciate theft," the man said. "Not from his stores. Not from anywhere." The old man whimpered. He tried to press himself further into the brick wall, as if he could dissolve into it. And Allara Chen, who had $17 and a prayer card and 12 days left to live as herself, who had a black eye and a torn uniform and bruises around her throat that spelled out the word property in a language only victims understood, stepped forward. She stepped between the 3 gunmen and the terrified old man. She did not think. That was important. She did not think about what would happen next or why it mattered or whether she had any right to care about anyone but herself at this moment in her life when everything was collapsing. She simply moved. "He has nothing," she said. Her voice was not steady. It was fractured, broken in places where her throat had been crushed. But it was clear. It cut through the sound of the rain like a blade through silk. "Leave him alone." The 3 men went absolutely still. The oldest one, the one with the serpent tattoo, raised his gun slightly. Not threateningly. Not yet. Just acknowledging the existence of a new variable in the equation. "Walk away, little girl," he said. "This is not your business." "Nothing is my business," Allara said. "But that is the only reason I can help him." Across the street, leaning against a black Mercedes sedan that cost more than Allara would make in 15 years of work, stood a man. Luca Moreno was 34 years old, though he carried himself like someone who had already lived several lifetimes. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders that suggested hours spent doing things that required strength and cruelty. His hair was dark, cut short and precise, with threads of silver running through at the temples. His suit was charcoal grey, tailored in Milan, worth more than most people's monthly rent. An open white shirt revealed the chest beneath, scarred in ways that told stories he would never speak aloud. At his wrist, a gold watch. On his fingers, silver rings. His eyes were dark, like flint, like the bottom of a well, like a man who had seen what darkness looked like and chosen to become it anyway. Sergio and Enzo stood beside him. Both men were in their late 20s, built like buildings, dressed identically in black suits that signaled their position in a hierarchy that did not announce itself publicly. Enzo had a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone. Sergio had a limp from a bullet wound taken 3 years ago, a wound he refused to have properly treated because he liked the pain as a reminder. They had been instructed to collect a debt from the convenience store owner, a man who had failed to pay his weekly protection fee. Simple work. Brutal work. The kind of work that took 30 seconds and left messages in blood. They had not expected this. They had not expected the broken girl with one eye swollen shut to step between their guns and an old man she did not know. Luca Marino watched her face. He did not watch her body, though she was thin enough that the soaked uniform hung loose on her frame. He did not watch her hands, though they were shaking so badly she could barely grip the $17 she was about to offer to the gunman as payment for the homeless man's life. He watched her face. Specifically, he watched her eye, the one that was still open. And what he saw there was something he had not seen in 15 years of building an empire on vengeance and violence and the careful systematic destruction of people who did not understand the difference between fear and respect. He saw absolute clarity in the moment before surrender. She was not afraid. She was terrified, yes, her body was screaming, her breath was coming in gasps, every instinct born from 27 years of survival was screaming at her to run. But her eye was clear. Her eye was steady. She had looked at the 3 guns and the death they represented, and she had made a choice. And that choice had nothing to do with logic or self-preservation or the mathematical certainty that she would lose. She had chosen to be brave because the alternative was to be complicit. And complicity, she had learned, was a slower death than a bullet. Luca raised his hand. One small gesture. Not a wave. Not a command. Barely a movement at all. But Sergio and Enzo lowered their weapons immediately. In 15 years of working for him, they had learned to read the smallest shifts in his body language. This shift meant something had changed. "Stand down," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. It carried no question mark at the end. The 3 men in the suits exchanged looks. The oldest one, the one with the serpent tattoo, turned slowly to look across the street at the man in the grey suit leaning against the Mercedes. Recognition crossed his face. Not fear. Not yet. But the beginning of understanding that the equation had changed. "Boss," the old man said. He lowered his gun entirely. Luca did not move. He did not walk toward them. He did not need to. His presence was enough. "The girl is under my protection now," he said. His words carried no inflection, no drama, no sense of a moment changing. He stated it like a fact. Like the sun rising. Like something that was always going to be true and had just required someone to announce it. Understand. The 3 men understood. They nodded, sharp and quick, and without another word, without even looking back at Allara or the homeless man they had come to collect payment from, they walked toward the street and disappeared into the night. Their footsteps faded into the sound of the rain. The homeless man scrambled to his feet. He did not speak. He simply ran, limping slightly, moving as fast as his old body could carry him away from Chen's corner store and the violence that had almost claimed him. He did not look back at Allara either. She stood alone on the sidewalk with $17 in her hand and a prayer card in her pocket and bruises around her throat that would take weeks to fade. And she did not yet know that the man across the street, the man with the flint eyes and the scarred chest and the gold watch worth more than her annual salary, had just decided that her broken life was suddenly worth protecting. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what is coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to the morning that set everything in motion, to understand how Allara Chen ended up beaten and broken on that street, and why she was willing to die for a stranger who had nothing but his dignity left to lose. 6 hours before Allara Chen stood in the November rain with $17 in her pocket, she woke in a converted closet that measured 6 feet wide and had never seen sunlight. The cot beneath her was thin, the mattress compressed from 2 years of her weight, and a single lamp on a milk crate served as her entire world of light. No window. No ventilation except a crack under the door. No sound except the distant hum of the Mercer mansion's climate control system and, if she listened hard enough, the breathing of a child sleeping 3 doors away. She did not need an alarm clock. Her body had learned to wake at 5:45 every morning without fail, muscle memory carved from desperation and love, 2 things that had become indistinguishable in her life. Allara sat up slowly, her spine cracking like old wood, and pressed her palms against her eyes. The bruises on her ribs from 3 nights ago had faded from purple to sickly yellow, and she had learned to breathe in a way that did not aggravate them. She had learned to do many things. She had learned to count money in increments so small they barely registered as currency. She had learned to smile when Catherine Mercer humiliated her. She had learned to pour every fragment of her capacity for love into a 7-year-old girl who could not see her face but somehow saw her anyway. Allara pulled on her uniform, plain grey dress, white apron, shoes scuffed from 2 years of running between rooms, and stepped into the Mercer mansion's service hallway. The marble floor stretched before her like a frozen lake, so polished it reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging 3 stories above. Security cameras swiveled in the corners, mechanical eyes that never blinked. Armed guards stood at the entrances in dark suits that cost more than her monthly salary, their earpieces gleaming, their hands resting on the bulges of weapons she had learned not to notice. The mansion was a fortress disguised as a home. Every door had a code. Every window had a sensor. Every corner had a camera watching, recording, documenting the lives of people who moved through it like ghosts inside a gilded cage. The kitchen was empty except for the industrial hum of refrigerators and the faint whisper of the ventilation system pulling air through copper ducts. Allara moved through the space with the precision of someone who had done this exact sequence 10,000 times. She opened the refrigerator, stainless steel, enormous, cold enough to preserve the lives of the wealthy, and retrieved a carton of orange juice, a container of oatmeal, fresh berries the size of coins, butter, honey, cinnamon. At 6:15, she carried the tray upstairs. The hallway was lined with photographs of the Mercer family through the decades, a legacy of wealth and connections and power, each face looking down at her with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. She climbed the servants' staircase, narrow and steep, designed so that the help could move through the house without disturbing the people who paid them. Lily's room was at the end of the east wing, windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward the Miami skyline. The child lay in a 4-poster bed with white linen that cost more than Allara's monthly rent, and she was already awake, already listening, because Lily had learned to navigate the world through sound the way others navigated through sight. "Vivi!" Lily called out. That was what she called Allara, a name she had invented because her 7-year-old mouth could not quite manage the full length of Allara. "Are you there?" "I am right here," Allara said, and she set the tray on the side table and moved to Lily's bed, where she sat on the edge and took the child's small hand in hers. Lily's palm was warm, trusting, completely without fear. "Good morning, my beautiful girl. It is 6:22, and the sun is just starting to touch the horizon. The sky is turning pink like the inside of a seashell, and I can smell jasmine from the garden below your window." Lily smiled, her sightless eyes moving slightly as if following the direction of Allara's voice. She was 7 years old and blind from birth, born to a family with enough money to buy anything except the one thing they could not purchase, sight for their daughter. But what they could do was hire someone to describe the world to her, someone to narrate existence in a way that made blindness feel less like a cage and more like a different kind of seeing. "What does pink sound like?" Lily asked, the way she always did. She had stopped asking what pink looked like approximately 18 months into knowing Allara. Pink sounds like a small bell ringing very far away, Allara said. Gentle and hopeful. The kind of sound that makes you believe morning is a gift instead of just a thing that happens. Lily reached for the orange juice, and Allara guided her hand, feeling the bones of the child's wrist, so delicate, so full of life. She described the steam rising from the oatmeal, the way it moved in patterns that looked like dancers frozen in the middle of a performance, the sweetness of the berries waiting in a small ceramic bowl painted with images of flowers that Lily would never see but whose existence Allara conveyed through words and touch, and the infinite patience of someone who had decided that this child was worth every second of her broken life. You make everything beautiful, Allara, Lily whispered, her mouth full of oatmeal and joy. The words landed in Alara's chest like a blade through butter, sharp and clean and devastating in their innocence. She did not cry. Her tears had dried up somewhere between her mother's funeral and the first time a man had hit her. But she felt something crack inside her ribcage, some sealed compartment of her heart opening just enough to let in the reality that she had become someone's whole world, and that world was about to be taken from her. At 7:45, Catherine Mercer entered the kitchen. She was 52 years old and had spent for decades perfecting the appearance of someone who had never worked a day in her life, someone for whom struggle existed only as a concept discussed over wine with other wealthy women. She wore a designer suit in pale grey, a Chanel, Allara had learned to recognize, with diamonds at her ears and throat and wrists, each stone the size of a small eye. Her hair was arranged in a style that took 40 minutes at a salon in Miami Beach, and her expression as she surveyed the kitchen was one of mild disgust, as if the very act of a kitchen existing was an offense against her refined sensibilities. Allara, she said, not quite making it a question. Why are you still wearing that uniform? I specifically requested that you purchase something more appropriate. Surely you understood that instruction. Allara's hands, which had been wiping down the counter, stopped moving. She turned toward Catherine with her face arranged into the shape of compliance. The uniform is clean, Mrs. Mercer. I washed it last night. I do not care if you washed it in champagne, Catherine said. It is worn. It is shabby. The soles of your shoes are splitting. Yesterday, at the charity luncheon, one of the board members asked me if we were experiencing financial difficulties. I was deeply embarrassed. You are embarrassing this household. Lily had finished her breakfast and was setting her spoon down with the precision of a child who had been taught, by love and repetition, exactly where things belonged on a plate. But she was listening. The child could hear the temperature change in the room, the shift from warmth to cold, and her small face arranged itself into the expression of someone experiencing a moment she did not have the power to stop or change. I understand, Mrs. Mercer, Allara said quietly. I will do better. See that you do, Catherine said, and she turned to leave, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded like judgment being rendered in real time. At 8 o'clock that evening, in a studio apartment across the city, Douglas Hale was waiting. The apartment was one room, kitchen, bedroom, living area, all separated by the kind of furniture that suggested someone living in a state of perpetual transition. Allara had moved in 2 years ago, had lived there in a state of controlled poverty, paying rent to a man who had seemed, at first, like someone simply running a business. She had learned better. Douglas Hale was 48 years old and gave the impression of someone whose best years had been spent doing things that left marks on his character that he would never be able to wash away. He had thinning hair the color of wet cardboard, a receding hairline that he tried to hide by combing strands across his scalp in a pattern that fooled no one, and eyes that contained the flat, predatory quality of something that hunted in the dark. He wore an expensive watch, a Rolex, Allara had learned to recognize, but the rest of his clothing was off the rack and cheap, a mismatch that suggested a man who had money but no taste, power but no dignity. He was standing in her hallway when she returned from the Mercer mansion, blocking her door, his body arranged in the posture of someone who had no intention of moving. Allara, he said. His voice was soft. That was the most terrifying thing about Douglas Hale, his capacity to deliver violence in a whisper. We need to discuss your rent situation. Her heart, which had been beating at a normal pace, shifted into a rhythm that felt like a bird trapped inside her ribs. She had been behind on rent before. She had negotiated extensions. But something in the way he was looking at her, something in the careful arrangement of his body, told her that negotiation was no longer an option. "I can have the money by the end of the month, Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice came out steady. She did not know how that was possible. "I have been taking extra hours at the mansion. I am saving. 3 months behind, Allara. 3 months of rent that you have not paid, 3 months of my generosity while you lived in my building for free." He stepped toward her. She did not move. The hallway was narrow. There was nowhere to go. "I have been patient. I have been more than patient. But patience, like money, runs out. And I have decided that it is time for you to catch up." "How much?" she asked. $150,000, he said. "I need it in 12 days. Or you lose everything. You lose your apartment. You lose your job with the Mercers because you will no longer have an address. You lose the girl." The words landed in her stomach like stones dropped into deep water. Lose the girl. As if Lily was hers to lose, as if the bond between them was something that could be severed by a man in a hallway deciding it would be so. "I cannot get that money," she said. "Mr. Hale, I make $2,000 a month. There is no way." He reached for her face. His hand came up slowly, giving her time to flinch, to pull away, to brace herself. But she did not. She stood frozen as his palm connected with her cheek, not a slap but a test of her compliance, his fingers gripping her jaw hard enough to leave marks. "Unless," he continued, his voice still soft, still a whisper, "we come to a different arrangement. You could work for me in other ways. Ways that would be much more profitable. Or—" He released her face and stepped closer, his other hand moving to her waist, his body pressing against hers, and she suddenly understood that this moment had been inevitable from the first time she had signed the lease, that all of this, the affordable rent, the kindness, the tolerance, had been designed to lead her exactly here, into a hallway where no one could hear her scream, into a moment where compliance looked like her only option. She jerked her head back, trying to create distance. His hand, still gripping her jaw, held firm. His other hand found her throat and squeezed, and the world narrowed to the sensation of pressure, the inability to breathe, the sudden understanding that she was about to be unmade by a man whose greatest skill was convincing himself that his predation was justified. She clawed at his face. Her fingernails connected with skin, and he cursed, pulling back just enough for her to gasp a breath. But he did not let go of her throat. He slammed her against the wall, and her vision exploded into stars, and his fists found her ribs, her eye, her stomach, methodical strikes that suggested he had practiced this choreography many times before. 12 days, Allara, he said between blows. $150,000 or I own you. I own your body. I own your time. I own every breath you take. He released her, and she collapsed onto the carpet, gasping, tasting blood, her vision swimming. He walked to the stairwell without looking back, his footsteps echoing down the concrete like judgment being delivered. At 10:30 that night, Allara dragged herself to the Mercer mansion. She used the service entrance, kept her head down, tried to move through the hallways like a ghost. But Catherine Mercer was waiting in the shadows of the east wing, as if she had been positioned there specifically to intercept her. The wealthy woman's eyes moved across Allara's face, the swelling around her eye, the bruises on her throat, the torn fabric of her uniform where Douglas Hale's hands had caught and ripped. And Catherine smiled. Not with concern. With satisfaction. "You look worse than usual," she said. "Do not let Lily touch your face tomorrow. I will not have her disturbed by your drama. The girl is sensitive. She needs stability. She does not need to sense that the people around her are falling apart." Allara did not respond. She could not. Her throat was closing, whether from the physical damage or from the realization that both Catherine and Douglas had aligned themselves against her, that her destruction had become a collaborative effort, a project they were working on together. She made it to her closet room and locked the door. She did not turn on the lamp. She sat in the darkness and felt her ribs throb and her throat burn and her heart break in increments so small that she almost did not notice it happening. At 11:30, she left the mansion. The November rain had started, cold and sharp, the kind of rain that cuts through clothing and finds skin and reminds you that the world is indifferent to your suffering. She walked through the streets of Miami with $17 in her pocket and a worn prayer card and bruises that would take weeks to fade, and she had nowhere to go, no one to call, nothing left except the memory of a blind child's voice saying, "You make everything beautiful, Allara." She did not know that 3 blocks away, a man was watching the corner of the street where she had stopped, a man with eyes like flint and a scar running from his temple to his jaw and hands that had built an empire on the principle that some debts must be paid in full. She did not know that her broken life had just become worth protecting. The rain fell in sheets that November night, cold enough to cut through skin. Allara Chen stood in the doorway of the Mercer mansion service entrance, her eye swollen shut, her throat marked with fingerprints that would take weeks to fade. 12 days. That was all Douglas Hale had given her to produce $150,000, or she would lose everything, her job, her home, and worst of all, Lily. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped into the downpour, knowing there was nowhere to go, no one to call. $17 in her pocket. A worn prayer card in the other. Both worthless against the weight of what was coming. 3 blocks away, outside Chen's corner store, 2 men in dark suits were backing a homeless man into the brick wall. The man was thin, skeletal, his hands raised in surrender. One of the men, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, the kind of face that belonged to someone who enforced debts for a living, raised his fist. Allara stepped between them without thinking. "Stop," she said. Her voice was quiet, but something in it made them pause. The men exchanged glances. This was a woman who had nothing, a woman barely standing, a woman who had no business interfering. And yet something in her broken face, the absolute certainty that she would die for this stranger, made them hesitate. The taller man's radio crackled. He touched his earpiece, listened, then lowered his fist. Both men holstered their weapons and melted back into the rain like smoke. From the shadows across the street, a figure watched. Luca was 34 years old but moved like a man who had lived centuries. His tailored charcoal suit cost more than Allara's annual salary. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, the result of a knife that had missed his eye by half an inch. His watch was solid gold, Italian-made, worth $40,000. But his eyes held something deeper than wealth, they held the weight of a man who had built an empire on the principle that every debt gets paid. He stepped from the shadows, rain streaming off his broad shoulders. He walked toward Allara slowly, studying her ruined face, the way she shielded the homeless man with her own body despite obvious pain. "You just interfered with my business," he said. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous, like a blade wrapped in silk. Allara met his eyes with her one good eye. She did not flinch. He was terrified. Whatever he did, he has suffered enough. Luca tilted his head slightly. The rain ran down his scar. "You know who I am?" "No." "You should be afraid." "I stopped being afraid when I had nothing left to lose," she said. Something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe. Respect. He signaled to Sergio, his lieutenant, the man who had lowered his fist. "Take her to the car. Get her medical attention." Allara backed away. "I do not need your help. You are bleeding onto my street. You need exactly my help." He tilted his head toward the black Mercedes idling at the curb. Enzo, his other lieutenant, stepped out and approached gently, extending his arm. She flinched so violently when he touched her elbow that he released her immediately, understanding without being told that touch had become something violent for this woman. Luca's eyes darkened. "Who did this to you?" "It does not matter." "It matters to me." But Allara ran, disappearing into the Miami rain before they could stop her, clutching her $17 and prayer card like they were the only real things left in the world. Luca watched her go. His men stood silent beside him, rain soaking through their expensive coats. In 15 years of working for him, They had never seen him move toward someone the way he had moved toward her. They had never heard that tone in his voice. "Find out everything about her," he said to Sergio. "Name, address, who hurt her. I want it by morning." Sergio nodded and disappeared into the rain. Luca stood alone in the street, the cold rain falling around him, and felt something he had not felt in 2 decades, the echo of helplessness. At 1:30 in the morning, in a penthouse office overlooking Biscayne Bay, Sergio delivered a manila folder. His hands were steady, but his voice betrayed something, a hardness that came from knowing what he was about to tell his boss. Allara Chen, 27 years old. Orphaned at 19. Works as live-in nanny for Catherine Mercer, one of the wealthiest families in Miami. Sleeps in what used to be a storage closet. Sends every spare dollar to St. Mary's Hospital. Apparently they treated her for something years ago, and she has been repaying them ever since, like she owes them a debt for her own survival. Luca read the file, his jaw tightening. She rents the closet from Douglas Hale, Sergio continued. He owns 5 properties in the area. Known for targeting vulnerable women, extracting favors in exchange for housing. No formal charges, his victims are too afraid or too desperate to report him. He has given her 12 days to produce $150,000, or he will evict her and ensure she loses her job. He has already started. Sergio's voice turned cold. The bruises on her face. Hale. Luca set the folder down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, Miami glittered like scattered diamonds. He was quiet for a long time. "My father was a kind man," he said finally. His voice was barely audible. "When I was 16, he stood up to the Castellano family. They came to our warehouse at midnight. I hid in a closet and watched them beat him to death. Slow. Methodical. Like they had all the time in the world and his suffering was the point. He did not turn around. He looked for me before he died. I could see him searching the shadows, hoping I would be brave enough to help. I was not. I was a coward." Sergio stood motionless. "I swore I would never be that coward again," Luca continued. "I built everything I have so that I would never feel that helpless watching someone he stopped himself. So that I would never be weak again." He turned back to Sergio. "Put 24-hour surveillance on her. If Hale or Catherine Mercer or anyone else lays a hand on her, I want to know immediately. And Sergio, if anyone touches her while I am sleeping, wake me up." Sergio nodded and left. Luca returned to the windows and looked out at the sleeping city, and somewhere in the darkness of his chest, something stirred that he had thought was dead, the desire to save someone. The next morning, at 7 o'clock, Allara woke in her closet room. Every muscle screamed. Her eye was swollen worse than yesterday, the bruises now deep purple like flowers blooming under her skin. Her ribs felt like broken glass when she breathed. She forced herself up anyway. She had to work. She could not afford to lose this job, not now, not when Lily needed her. She put on her last clean uniform, black pants, white blouse, both worn soft from 100 washings, and made her way to Lily's room. The little girl sat at her breakfast table, 6 years old, blind since birth, her small hands reaching out into the space where Allara usually stood. "Allara? Your voice sounds different. Are you sick?" Allara knelt beside her, took Lily's small hands, and guided them away from her battered face. "Just tired, sweetheart. Let me tell you about the rain last night." It sounded like 1,000 tiny drums on the windows, all talking to each other, telling stories about where they came from. Lily's face lit up. She smiled and squeezed Allara's hand. "Tell me more. Tell me about the colors it makes." "Silver," Allara whispered. "Like liquid silver falling from the sky. And when it hits the ground, it sounds like wind chimes, all the different notes mixing together. Do you remember wind chimes?" "Like the ones in the garden," Lily said. "The ones you let me ring." "Yes. Exactly like that." The door to the nursery opened with a sharp click of heels. Catherine Mercer entered, her face arranged in an expression of disgust. She was 51 years old but maintained herself with the precision of someone who believed that aging was a personal failure. Her silk blouse was cream-colored, her jewelry understated and astronomically expensive. She looked at Allara's face like she was looking at spoiled fruit. "You look like trash," Catherine said. "Lily, come with me. Allara needs to understand where the boundaries are. She needs to learn her place." She pulled Lily away. The little girl cried out, confused, reaching back toward Allara's voice. "But the stories Allara was telling me about the rain. Allara can tell you stories another time. Come." Allara watched them go, her heart breaking in pieces so small she could not even count them anymore. She sat alone in Lily's room with the breakfast getting cold, understanding that every day here was a day borrowed on credit, and the bill was coming due. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Allara's phone rang. Unknown number. Her hand shook as she answered. "Cafe Bellini. 4 o'clock. Come alone." The voice was male, commanding, unmistakable. "Luca Marino." She hung up and sat frozen for 10 minutes, then she decided not to go. At 4:30, as she emptied trash into the bins behind the mansion, a black Mercedes pulled up to the service entrance. The guards who stood there, large men, trained men, men who worked for Catherine Mercer and could have called the police or made a scene, recognized the car immediately. They stepped aside without a word, pale as ghosts. Sergio and Enzo emerged first, scanning the grounds. Then Luca stepped out, his cashmere coat dark as midnight, his scar prominent in the late afternoon light. Allara froze, trash bag in hand. "You did not come," Luca said. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate. "I do not know you. But I know you, Allara Chen." He stopped a few feet away, his eyes taking in every detail of her injuries. "I know Douglas Hale gave you 12 days to produce $150,000. I know Catherine Mercer humiliates you daily in front of the child you love. I know you sleep in a closet and give everything you earn to a hospital that treated you years ago, as if your own survival is a debt that must be repaid forever." Allara's breath caught. The trash bag fell from her hands. "How?" she started. "Because I make it my business to know things that matter," Luca said. His voice was different than it had been in the rain, softer, more deliberate, like he was choosing each word carefully. "I watched you step between armed men for a stranger last night. You had $17 and nothing to lose, and you chose courage. That is not the behavior of somebody, Allara. That is the behavior of somebody extraordinary." She looked away. Her whole body was shaking. "I am nobody. Whatever you want, I cannot. That is where you are wrong." His voice dropped. It was almost gentle. "I was helpless once. I watched someone I love suffer, and I was too weak to stop it. So I built something. I built power. And I swore I would never turn away when I saw someone being destroyed. Not again." Enzo stepped forward and handed her an envelope. Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside was a check for $150,000. The world tilted. She nearly dropped it. "No. No, I cannot accept this. What do you want from me? What is the price for this?" "There is no price," Luca said. "No one helps without wanting something." "I do," he said. "Take the money. Pay Hale. Take Lily away from Catherine if you need to. Build a life where you are not broken every single day. That is all I want." He handed her a card with a single phone number printed on it, nothing else. "When you need me, call this number." At midnight, in her closet room, Allara sat holding the check, unable to process that such kindness existed in the world. She thought of Lily's voice, of the rain stories, of a future that might not be suffocating. But at 9 o'clock that evening, Douglas Hale had learned that a man like Luca Marino was interested in his tenant. And Douglas Hale was not the kind of man to let go of his prey. He appeared at the service entrance as she took out the trash, his breath reeking of whiskey, his eyes hot with rage. He grabbed her arm and dragged her into the shadows behind the mansion where no one could hear her scream. "You think you can run to some gangster?" he snarled. His hand closed around her throat. "You are mine, Allara. You owe me, and you will pay." She could not breathe. The world was narrowing, closing, dying. Her phone was in her pocket. With her last breath, after he threw her to the ground, she pulled it out with shaking fingers and dialed the number on the card. It rang once. "Allara," Luca answered. He was already awake. He was always awake now. "He came again," she whispered. "He hurt me again." Silence. "Then, where are you?" "Service entrance." "The mansion." "Stay exactly where you are." "I am coming." The line went dead. 15 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up. Luca stepped out, and his men saw something they had never seen before. Their boss, the man who had built an empire on controlled rage, was trembling with it. He found Allara on the ground, hugging her knees, new bruises blooming purple on her throat like a second death sentence. He knelt in front of her, and his hands shook as he tilted her face toward the light to see what Hale had done. Something in his chest hardened into something sharp, something final, something that would cut deep. "Sergio," he said quietly, "find Douglas Hale. Bring him to the warehouse. And Sergio, do not let him see it coming." The rain fell in sheets against the service entrance of the Mercer mansion, each drop hitting the concrete like an accusation. Allara Chen lay crumpled in the mud, her body a map of fresh bruises blooming purple and black across her skin. Douglas Hale stood over her, his shadow blocking out what little November light remained, his two men laughing like hyenas over carrion. Her ribs screamed with every breath. Her vision blurred, rain or tears, she could no longer tell the difference. $150,000, Hale snarled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. "Now." Alara's hand shook as she reached into her soaked pocket. The check was there, signed by Luca Moreno, a lifeline that felt like a noose. She pulled it out, the paper already bleeding ink from the rain. Hale snatched it, his eyes widening as he read the signature. The color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. "You stupid girl," he breathed. "Do you know what you have done?" He slapped her so hard her head snapped sideways, and she tasted blood mixed with rain. His boot came next, aimed at her wrapped ribs, and the sound that escaped her throat was not quite human. But what Hale did not know, what none of them knew, was that Sergio had been following Allara since she left the safe apartment. And Sergio had just made the call. The first sound was the car doors. Multiple doors slamming in perfect succession, like a drumbeat of judgment. Then footsteps, not running, not hurried, but measured and inevitable, like the footsteps of men who had nothing left to fear. 12 men in black suits materialized through the rain like ghosts taking human form, surrounding Hale and his men with the precision of a military operation. They moved in absolute silence except for the percussion of their shoes on wet concrete. Sergio and Enzo stepped forward, their faces carved from stone, their eyes empty of mercy. Hale's laughter died in his throat. His men tried to run. One made it 3 steps before Enzo caught him by the collar and threw him to the ground so hard the air left his lungs in a whoosh that sounded like defeat. "Wait, I did not know, she did not tell me," a Hale's voice cracked, a child's voice suddenly, pleading. Then Luca Moreno stepped through the circle of his men. He moved like a knife through silk, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the downpour, his dark eyes colder than the November rain that fell without mercy. He was 34 years old but carried the weight of 15 years of losses, of a father murdered, of a code written in blood. His gaze traveled from Hale's face down to Allara lying in the mud, her body folded in on itself like a broken prayer. Something shifted in his expression, a hardening, a crystallizing, a moment where rage became something sharp enough to cut through bone. Even his most loyal men took a step back. In 15 years, they had never seen him look at anyone with that kind of intensity, that kind of absolute fury masked in perfect calm. Luca knelt beside Allara without taking his eyes off Hale. His coat was worth more than everything Allara had ever owned, and it touched the mud without hesitation. He tilted her face toward the inadequate light, studying the fresh damage, the blood at the corner of her mouth, the way her body trembled from cold and pain and fear. "I told you that you were under my protection," he said softly. His voice sounded like thunder wrapped in ice. He stood. He turned to Douglas Hale. And when he spoke again, his words cut like a blade through the rain. "You made a mistake." Hale bolted. Sergio and Enzo were faster, intercepting him before he reached the property line, forcing him down into the mud on his knees. His men were already unconscious on the ground, their bodies arranged in the rain like fallen soldiers. "Please, Moreno, please, we can make a deal." Hale's voice spiraled into desperation, into the sound of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "No deals," Luca said quietly. He nodded once. Just once. His men moved like a choreograph machine. Hale's screams erupted into the rain, raw, primal screams of someone who had finally understood that the universe was not going to save him, that consequences were not theoretical but visceral and approaching fast. They dragged him toward the black van waiting at the curb, his hands clawing at the pavement, his legs kicking, his voice breaking on the word please over and over until the van doors slammed shut and his cries became muffled echoes. The van pulled away into the November rain, and Douglas Hale disappeared into the Miami underworld like he had never existed at all. He would be handed to the Volkov family, the Russian bratva who had been searching for him for 2 years after he swindled them in a property scheme worth $200,000. They did not forgive debts. They did not believe in mercy. Death would be too quick, too easy, too merciful for what was coming. But that was not the end. Luca turned to face the Mercer mansion. Through a second-floor window, Catherine Mercer watched, her face the color of old bone. She saw the black SUVs arriving, already saw the agents exiting with federal badges and subpoenas and the kind of certainty that came from overwhelming evidence. Luca made a single phone call, his eyes never leaving hers, and within minutes the mansion was surrounded. The agents moved with the precision of people who had been gathering information for days. Which they had. Luca's people had uncovered everything, the embezzlement, the millions diverted from the charitable foundation intended for children's hospitals, the offshore accounts, the falsified documents, all of it meticulously documented and delivered to the FBI wrapped in a bow made of circumstantial evidence that was anything but circumstantial. Catherine Mercer was led out in handcuffs while news cameras captured every second. Her face was everywhere within the hour, socialite arrested for charity fraud. 40 years in federal prison. Total financial ruin. Public humiliation that would echo through Miami society forever. Her name would become synonymous with greed, with the cruelty of wealthy women who used power to hurt the powerless. Meanwhile, in the rain and mud outside the service entrance, Luca lifted Allara from the ground. She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered, her body convulsing with shock and cold and the weight of everything that had just happened. He carried her to his Mercedes, wrapped her in his coat, a cashmere garment worth 3 months of her old salary, and held her while she sobbed against his chest. "Lily," she whispered. "I have to get to Lily." Catherine said she was hysterical, that she was hurting herself, and I left her there, Anne. "Sure," he said, and the tenderness in his voice contradicted everything his face had promised moments before. "We will get her. I promise you. She is safe. Catherine is gone. Lily is with protective services, but she will come to us. I promise." Sergio watched from a distance, his expression carefully blank, but something in his chest shifted. In 15 years of working for Luca Moreno, through violence and vengeance and the slow grinding work of building an empire, he had never seen his boss hold someone like they were made of glass. Like they were precious. Like they mattered more than the empire itself. The rain continued to fall, relentless and cold, but Allara Chen was no longer alone in it. And in the parking lot of the Mercer mansion, as news vans arrived and federal agents worked through the night, the question that echoed through the underworld was no longer whether Douglas Hale would resurface. It was something else entirely. It was whether Luca Moreno, the man who had built his entire world on the principle that emotion was a weakness, had finally found something worth abandoning that principle for. 2 weeks had passed since the night Allara Chen watched Douglas Hale collapse to his knees, screaming her name like a curse he could not take back. 2 weeks since Catherine Mercer's empire crumbled in a single evening, her arrested face broadcast across every news channel in Miami. 2 weeks since Allara began the impossible task of learning how to breathe without terror. The safe apartment Luca had arranged occupied the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Miami. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a painting, distant, beautiful, unreachable. Allara stood in the kitchen each morning and marveled that the refrigerator was full. Real food. Not scraps or dollar menu items. Vegetables that had never seen the inside of a garbage can. Milk that would not expire for weeks. Lily slept in the bedroom down the hall, finally sleeping without nightmares. The adoption paperwork had moved through the courts with remarkable speed. Luca had called in favors, whispered threats to the right judges, pulled strings that moved entire systems. The legal document sat in a folder on the kitchen counter. Allara was Lily's legal guardian now. Lily belonged to her, and she belonged to Lily, and that impossible truth still made her hand shake when she held the papers. The intercom buzzed at 7 in the evening. Allara's first instinct was still fear, a reflex carved into her bones by 12 days of Douglas Hale's threats, by years of sudden violence, by a world that had taught her that unexpected visitors meant danger. Her heart hammered. She checked the security monitor, and the tension in her shoulders released like a held breath. Luca stood in the lobby, and he was not alone. Sergio and Enzo flanked him as always, but what caught Allara's attention was what Luca carried. A paper bag from the grocery store. A child's book with bright colors on the spine. His posture was casual, unburdened, nothing like the lethal man who had orchestrated the destruction of 2 people's lives just 14 nights ago. She let him up. When the elevator doors opened, Luca moved toward her with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had learned to walk slowly around fragile things. His expensive suit, tailored wool in charcoal, cufflinks silver, made the apartment feel smaller somehow. More intimate. The way wealth compressed space when it entered a room. "You came," Allara said, and then immediately wondered why she had said that, as if she needed to state the obvious. "I said I would." His voice was low, warm in a way she was still learning to recognize as genuine. The tenderness in it was like a blade wrapped in ice, dangerous precisely because it promised not to hurt. "How is Lily today?" She was restless this morning. The new school she is going to starts next week, and she is nervous about the other children. Allara took the paper bag from his hands. Inside lay fresh fruit, organic labels, prices that made her throat tight. All of this was still new. All of it still felt stolen. She is asleep now, but she will be awake soon. She always asks when you are coming. Something flickered across Luca's face, not quite a smile, but something close to it. "Then let me surprise her." He moved toward the hallway with the book still in his hand. Allara followed, watching the man who had murdered without blinking carry a children's picture book like it was made of porcelain. In the doorway of Lily's room, he paused. The girl slept on her side, one small hand tucked beneath her chin, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Peaceful. Finally, blessedly peaceful. Luca sat on the edge of the bed with extraordinary gentleness. He waited until Lily's eyes fluttered open, until she oriented herself to his presence through touch and sound rather than sight. "Colors," he said quietly. "I have come to read to you about colors." Lily's entire body brightened. "All the colors?" "All of them," Luca promised. And so began the strangest, most beautiful ritual Allara had ever witnessed. Luca opened the book and began to describe colors in a way that made her understand he had never truly seen them before, not like this. Not with the intensity of someone trying to paint a world for another person's imagination. "Red," he said, his deep voice filling the small room like thunder translated into gentleness. "Red is the color of anger, but also of roses. It is warm. It burns. When you hold something red in your hand, you feel alive. Red is passion and blood and the final moment before the sun disappears below the horizon. Red is dangerous. Red is beautiful. Lily listened, her sightless eyes tracking his voice, and Allara felt something fracture inside her chest. This man, this dangerous man with blood on his hands and an empire built on violence, was teaching a blind child poetry. An hour passed. Then another. Luca described blue as sadness and sky and water and the color of Lily's favorite stuffed animal. He described yellow as warmth and danger and the smell of lemon and hope. He described green as growth and patience and the feeling of grass beneath bare feet on a summer day. When he finished, Lily was drowsy again, and Luca kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made Allara have to turn away. In the kitchen, while Luca helped her prepare dinner, his movements careful, clearly unfamiliar with the work but determined to learn, Allara asked the question that had been burning in her chest for 2 weeks. "Why are you doing this?" Luca did not look up from the vegetables he was chopping with methodical precision. Each cut was exact, controlled, a man accustomed to consequence. "What do you mean?" "All of this?" "Lily." "Me." "The apartment." "The adoption fees." "The lawyers." "The way you sit with her and describe colors like you are painting her entire world." Alara's voice trembled. "You could be running your empire. Instead you are here, teaching a blind girl about green." He set down the knife and turned to face her fully. His eyes were dark, almost black in the kitchen light, and they held something she had learned to recognize as honesty. The rarest commodity in his world. "Do you know what I thought about the night my father died?" he asked quietly. "I was 16 years old, and rival organizations came to the restaurant where we were dining. I watched him die, Allara. Watched him bleed out on white tablecloths while I hid under a table like a coward. And I spent the next 20 years building walls so high that no one could ever reach me again, so no one could ever hurt me like that again." He moved closer. "I swore I would never care about anyone enough to feel that pain. I built an empire and filled it with violence because violence cannot be disappointed. Violence cannot betray you. Violence cannot die." Alara's breath caught. "And then you stepped between armed men for a stranger, and I understood something I had spent 20 years trying to forget. That there is still courage in the world. That there are still people who fight for others even when it costs them everything." He reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that contradicted his size, his power, everything he was supposed to be. "You changed something in me, Allara Chen. You made me remember that I do not have to be made of stone. That I am allowed to choose something other than fear. But your enemies will be dealt with. I have survived this long because I am strategic, ruthless, and I do not hesitate. That does not change." His hand moved to her cheek. "But I will not let fear drive out love. I will not build another prison of isolation because I am afraid of losing something precious. Lily has already changed my life. You have already changed my life. And I am choosing to let that change continue." The sound of the city filtered through the windows, distant traffic, the occasional horn, the white noise of millions of lives happening simultaneously. Allara leaned into his hand, and for the first time since she was a child, she thought about what it might feel like to be safe. Dinner was simple, chicken and vegetables and rice. They ate together, and Luca told her about the legitimacy paperwork he had begun filing. Shell companies would become real estate developments. Transportation networks would transform into delivery services. The underworld connections would slowly dissolve, replaced by actual businesses that paid taxes and operated in daylight. "It will take years," he said. "But I am building something different now. Something that could survive after I am gone. Something for Lily to inherit that is not a gun." "For Lily?" Allara asked carefully. Luca met her eyes across the table. "For our daughter. If you will let me be her father." The words hung in the kitchen air like a held breath. Alara's throat tightened. She thought of the night she had written the goodbye letter, the prayer card worn in her pocket, the moment she had decided that leaving was the only way to protect him. She had been so certain that love meant sacrifice, that caring for someone meant removing yourself from their life. "I want to say yes," she whispered. "But I am terrified." So am I, Luca said simply. Every single day, I am terrified that I will make a mistake and hurt you, or that someone from my past will find their way to your door, or that I will not know how to be what you need. But I am more terrified of losing you. I am more terrified of that than anything else. He stood, moved around the table, and pulled her up from her chair. His arms wrapped around her, and she fit against him like she had been designed for this space. Stay, Allara. Stay with me and Lily. Let me build something beautiful instead of something terrible. Let me try. She rested her forehead against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady, alive, human. All of it so impossibly human. Okay, she said. Okay? I will stay. We will stay. That night, after Luca had gone and Lily was asleep, Allara found herself looking at the worn prayer card that had lived in her pocket for months. The Virgin Mary, faded and creased from constant handling, from 1,000 moments of desperate hope. She had thought prayer was meant to change the world. Instead, it had changed her, had given her the strength to walk between dangerous men, to choose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, to trust when trust seemed impossible. She slipped the prayer card beneath her pillow and closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that some things might actually be worth the risk. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with the people you love. Every comment you leave is a precious source of motivation. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace.